leaders.
Duly noted.
And Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that myself, along with Senators Haggerty, Peters, and Portman, be recognized to speak for up to 5 minutes each before the scheduled recess.
Without objection.
Madam President, I was not intending to speak. As you know, I was presiding, and you were kind to spell me. But as I was hearing colleagues talk on the floor about the state of our country, what I was hearing from my Republican colleagues were words like malaise, funk, disaster. I was seeing visuals of a house on fire. And so I was compelled to stand and just offer a few extemporaneous remarks. I don't think America's a disaster. I don't think America is on fire. I don't think America is in a deep, unyielding malaise. I've heard colleagues talk about the situation in the world and use the appeasement word. I've heard language both in committee hearings this morning and here on the floor that I would characterize as kind of a blame America first attitude. If something is going on, if a dictator like Vladimir Putin acts in a horrific way, it's got to be America's fault. It's got to be Joe Biden's fault. I don't think our instinct should be to blame America first when dictators in the world undertake despicable actions. And what I've noticed in these comments today, trashing our president and trashing the country, is sort of a cherry picking of evidence. My colleagues have brought up some things that really are very legitimate concerns. Inflation, a very, very legitimate concern that has to be addressed. But I've listened to these speeches and not one has talked about record job growth. Not one has talked about strong GDP growth. Not one has talked about dramatic increases in the wages and salaries of low and moderate income people. Is that because my colleagues are unaware of those things? No, they know these things. They're just choosing not to discuss them because what they want to do is to paint a picture of an American malaise, an American funk, an American disaster. That's not who this country is. And yet my colleagues are very willing to paint a false picture by omitting key evidence. I listened to the speeches this morning. Not one mentioned that COVID deaths and hospitalizations are coming down dramatically, and that the CDC now has said during most of my Commonwealth, most of the country, you needn't wear masks indoors. I would think they might have mentioned that because part of the reason for this recent progress is the vaccines that were developed during the previous administration. They could take a little credit for it, but no, they didn't mention it at all. COVID is coming down. Strong economic growth, strong job growth, strong wage and salary growth. And around the world, a NATO that the previous president trashed when he was cozying up to the dictator Vladimir Putin is demonstrating to the entire world that when it is resolved to unify, the power of American-led alliances is a huge force for good in this world. And so I'm just trying to grapple with the one-sided presentation of American disaster, American malaise, American funk. And let me tell you, here's the way I understand it. The last 2 years have been brutal. The death toll to COVID is now nearly 950,000. It will eclipse 1 million. I'm 64 years old as of a couple days ago. It's been the hardest 2 years in my life for our country. The death, the illness, the economic devastation, the job loss. It's been brutal here, and it's been brutal all around the world. And we're not completely with it in the rearview mirror yet. I suspect what you're going to hear President Biden say tonight, this is my intuition, I don't have knowledge, is he's going to acknowledge the incredible pain that we've been living under in this country and around the world for the last 2 years, nearly unprecedented in a century. And he's going to point out that there are still significant challenges. There's still too high a percentage of Americans that haven't taken advantage of these vaccines. And yes, inflation is a problem. There are problems that we have to deal with. But when you look at strong job growth and strong wage growth and strong GDP growth, when you look at declining case numbers, I'll tell you what I see. I see the beginnings of something that we often see in American life, an American comeback. We are comeback people. We are comeback people. A friend of mine once said, tough times don't last, tough people do. We are tough people. And as I travel around Virginia, I was traveling around Virginia last week, I don't fundamentally see funk or malaise or poor, pitiful me, or blaming America for the woes of the world, or blaming Joe Biden for the reality of a tough situation we've been living through. I see people with their chin up and their head held high, who will acknowledge that we have challenges and that we've got problems to solve, but who believe that we are on our way to a better chapter after a very difficult last couple of years. That's the can-do spirit I see around Virginia. That's the can-do spirit I believe has always characterized Americans. Not a we're on fire, it's a malaise time, it's a funk time. No, I see a can-do spirit and the beginnings of an American comeback underway after what has been the most painful 2 years during my 64 here on the planet. And I don't know whether, if I'm right, that's good news or bad news for my colleagues who are here on the floor painting the negative picture. I would think it would be good news. But if it were good news, why wouldn't I have heard some acknowledgement of job growth or wage growth or GDP growth? Why wouldn't I have heard acknowledgement about COVID cases coming down? We do need to work together. Madam President, you inspired all of us with your work on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which, as I was traveling around Virginia last week, and I'm sure most of us were doing this in our state, my mayors and my state officials and my local economic development officials were talking with excitement about what this would mean in terms of the rebuilding of American communities where we haven't invested in infrastructure for a very long time. I don't think this is a moment where the leadership class of this country should be amplifying pessimism about this country. I think it's a moment where the leadership class of this country should be amplifying an optimistic can-do message that I think is in accord with the values of Virginians and values of Americans. And I suspect that kind of a message, the acknowledgement of the difficult reality, but the foundation being laid for the beginnings of an American comeback after 2 tough years, I suspect that's the message that we're going to hear from President Biden tonight. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.